Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a genuinely mind-blowing, rags-to-riches story, arguably history's most mythologized figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. We're going to trace how this scrawny, completely isolated teenager with literally zero money to his name somehow transformed into the absolute master of Europe.
So, to really wrap our heads around where he started, we kind of have to look at where he ended up. Just take a look at the sheer, unbelievable scale of the opulence in this coronation scene. I mean, you are looking at the absolute zenith of power here. Notice the insane wealth, the velvet, the gold, the sheer imperial weight radiating off of everyone in the room. This is Emperor Napoleon, a guy holding the fate of an entire continent in his hands. But what if I told you that the guy wearing that crown used to literally starve in a freezing room wearing threadbare clothes?
He actually talked about it later in life. He once remarked, that he knew all about hardship because he lived it back when he was a first lieutenant, eating dry bread. And that's our absolutely crucial takeaway today. The glittering emperor you just saw, he was preceded by a starving, broke, yet fiercely disciplined young soldier. Let's see how this all builds.
Section 1. Starting from extreme poverty.
Let's rewind the clock to 1784. Imagine this, a scrawny 15-year-old kid arriving in the grand, super intimidating capital of France, and his pockets are completely empty. The second he walks into the military academy, he hits this massive social wall. On one side, you've got your typical Parisian cadets, right? Wealthy kids throwing parties, hitting the theaters, just living it up. And on the other side, you've got young Napoleon. Since he had absolutely no money, he was forced into this extreme isolation. He actively avoided hanging out because, well, he couldn't afford to laugh and play like the rest of them. Instead, he channeled every single ounce of his energy into rigorous study. The guy was fiercely proud. He kept his poverty a total secret and just buried himself in his books.
Section 2. Sacrifices for the family.
When Napoleon was just 16, his dad passed away. And suddenly, bam, the weight of the entire Bonaparte family drops right onto this teenager's incredibly thin shoulders. To make his poverty super tangible for us, check out this literal translation from his tailor's notebook. Making broadcloth trousers, 4 francs. Making underwear, 1 franc. Making embroidery, 1 franc. Our sources point out that he actually haggled the tailor down on the cost of making his underwear just so he could afford to survive. I mean, it's an incredible detail, right? It really grounds this giant of history in the gritty, day-to-day reality of just trying to get by.
And speaking of getting by, 1. That is the exact number of meals Napoleon ate every single day. He would purposely wait until 3 p.m. to eat his one and only meal. A totally calculated move just to stretch out whatever meager funds he had. He was practically starving to death, but he hid the whole thing behind this fierce, unyielding pride so nobody would dare pity him.
You really see how these sacrifices profoundly shaped who he became. I mean, he completely gave up his own youth to be the head of the family. He paid for his younger brother Louis's education straight out of his incredibly tiny sub-lieutenant's salary. To make ends meet, he shared a tiny room just to split rent. He's eating dry bread, brushing his own worn-out uniforms to avoid paying a servant, and at his lowest point, he literally pawned his own watch to a friend's brother just to get some cash. You just don't endure that level of hardship without forging an absolute iron will.
Section 3. Military genius in Toulon. Okay, so we're moving from this quiet, grinding suffering of his youth right into the loud, absolute chaos of war. This is where the starving student finally puts all that rigorous study into practice. August 1793, anti-revolutionary royalists commit high treason and literally just hand over the vital French port of Toulon to the English. The French army scrambles to lay siege. Then, in September, the French artillery commander Dalmartin gets wounded in battle. Suddenly, there's this massive leadership void, and instantly, almost like he'd been waiting his whole life for this exact second, young Napoleon steps right up. He takes command of the artillery with this total, unshakable confidence.
And he didn't just charge, he completely revolutionized their entire artillery strategy. His approach was totally unprecedented. He was seeing angles, choke points, and elevations that the older generals were completely blind to. His strategic mastery at Toulon didn't just win them the battle, it proved his undeniable worth to the Republic and officially put him on the map as a major military talent.
Section 4. Saving the convention government. But the stakes? They're about to get so much higher. Jumping ahead to 1795, we're no longer just fighting over a port. We're talking about the survival of the French Republic itself.
Paris is an absolute chaos. The post-revolution convention government is teetering on the edge of total collapse. There's this massive, highly organized uprising by royalist sympathizers sweeping through the streets, and they're threatening to tear down the government and undo the whole revolution. Just total panic everywhere.
Just to put this into perspective, look at the sheer scale of the threat here. You've got 40,000 armed rebels marching directly on the gates of the government. 40,000. The defending forces? Vastly outnumbered and totally demoralized. So in a desperate, kind of wild move, the government points to that young, super ambitious artillery officer they remembered from too long, Napoleon, and they give him absolute command to save them.
And notice how insanely fast he operates. On the night of the 13th of Vendémiaire, he takes command, and he does not hesitate for a second. He rapidly deploys his artillery to these narrow, key choke points in the city streets. When the rebels advance, he fires decisively, no flinching whatsoever. He completely crushes the rebellion and restores order in a matter of hours. The brutal, rapid-fire efficiency of his tactical mind literally saved the government in a single day.
Section 5. The woman who changed his life.
But right at the moment he becomes the undisputed hero of the Republic, we've actually got to pause, because into this totally rigid, tactical, battle-hardened life steps the one variable that Napoleon absolutely could not control with artillery fire. Who is the woman destined to capture the heart of this hardened, impoverished hero? After all the bloodshed, all the dry bread, and the cold military calculations, who actually breaks through to the guy underneath?
Enter Josephine. The sources describe her just beautifully. Deep blue eyes, draped in soft, light Indian silk. She was the absolute picture of soft elegance, a stark, almost shocking contrast to Napoleon's rigid, calculating, war-torn vibe. She was a woman of high society, and she had never, ever encountered a heart that burned quite like Napoleon's.
Because, you see, his greatest conquest wouldn't actually be on the battlefield. All those years of isolation, all that unspent emotion from his youth, all that fierce, unyielding passion, he took every single drop of it and poured it into a deep, consuming, almost obsessive love for her. The impoverished soldier who had nothing finally found something he wanted more than survival.
So what happens now? How will this unexpected, totally all-consuming love alter the destiny of this incredibly driven man? When the mind of a military genius gets hijacked by the unpredictable human heart, what happens to the empire he is destined to build? Well, I'll leave you to ponder that beating heart beneath the emperor's armor. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. You know, when we think of Napoleon Bonaparte, we usually picture the supreme military genius, right? The guy whose very name made European monarchs literally tremble. The emperor who completely reshaped the world map. But today, we're exploring a massive paradox, because the very man who brought entire empires to their knees was utterly subservient to a woman in a Paris salon. It's a story of absolute power, blinding passion, and a betrayal that fundamentally changed the course of history. Okay, let's break down this crazy contrast. On one hand, you have the commander-in-chief of the French army, a guy issuing orders to the Pope and dictating terms to kings. But on the other hand, you see his hidden reality. He was in this helpless, almost pitiful emotional state, essentially acting like a servant, desperately begging his own wife for just a single letter. A total master of the battlefield, yet completely defenseless against his own heart. Part 1. Invincible General, Defeated Lover. To really understand how this happened, we've got to look at the beginning. When they met, Josephine was a 32-year-old widow looking for protection and stability for her kids. But the 27-year-old Napoleon, he was madly, unconditionally consumed by her. So they marry in March of 1796, and this lightning-fast timeline is absolutely crucial. Just 12 days after the wedding, Napoleon is forced to leave to command the army of Italy. 12 days. There was literally no honeymoon phase. That abrupt separation instantly created this extreme long-distance tension that would just tear his mind apart. Part 2. Love Letters from the Battlefield. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer absurdity of the situation. Napoleon is out there pulling off these spectacular, mind-boggling military victories, actively reshaping Europe, right? But his mind is entirely fixated on her absence. His soldiers are celebrating, but he's pacing his tent, agonizing over her silence. And the communication gap is wild. Napoleon is sending pages and pages of burning, obsessive passion. And Josephine, when she actually bothered to reply, she sent maybe 3 lines tops. In fact, to her friends in Paris, she actually mocked him, calling his devotion ridiculous. Just listen to the actual words he was sending from the front lines. He wrote, "Give me 1,000 kisses, for my blood is burning." Wow, it's just incredibly raw, isn't it? You can really hear him descending into this intense, unrequited infatuation. That is not the voice of a conqueror. That is a deeply vulnerable man laying his entire soul bare to someone who's barely paying attention. But wait, as her silence drags on, it gets much darker. He writes, "You don't love me. My heart is breaking. You leave me in this terrifying anxiety." Look at that escalation. He goes from passionate longing straight to deep paranoia and then to agonizing pain. He's winning every single battle on the field, but he's losing his mind over her neglect, terrified that his worst fear, that she just doesn't love him, is actually true. Part 3. Betrayal in the Milan Palace. So, eventually, after exhausting literally every excuse she could invent to stay and party in Paris, Josephine is forced to travel to Italy. She arrives at the magnificent Serbelloni Palace in Milan. And you'd think, okay, finally this reunion will calm his burning anxiety, right? Nope. Not even close. Instead of comforting him, she actively neglects him right in front of his own army. She completely ignores his emotional needs, throws herself into the social scene, and surrounds herself with the attention of young military officers. She treated the supreme commander of the army like an afterthought. And out of that group of officers comes the ultimate betrayal. Enter Charles Hippolyte. He was this young, attractive, super engaging officer, and Josephine starts this deeply humiliating affair with him. It got so bad that this guy practically became the master of her household. It was the ultimate insult, the affair that finally shattered Napoleon's heart and turned Europe's greatest military genius into a domestic joke. I want you to pause for a second. Put yourself in his shoes. How does the master of Europe react to being a laughingstock? Just imagine being the supreme commander, demanding absolute loyalty from thousands of troops in life-or-death combat, only to know that back home, you're being mocked and deeply betrayed by the one person you absolutely worship. So the crucial point is how he handled it. When the truth finally became undeniable, his initial rage was, as you'd expect, explosive. He almost divorced her right then and there. But, and here's the crazy part, when Josephine brought her crying kids to plead for her, Napoleon actually softened just enough to pardon her. He swallowed his pride to avoid a massive public scandal. But make no mistake, they stayed married on paper, but that pure, burning, passionate love, that permanently died. Part 4. The Emperor looks for an heir. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive shift that happens next. We enter a totally new era. The desperate lover is gone, replaced by the cold, pragmatic emperor. He realizes romance is a dead end. He has to focus on legacy now. Look at this iconic coronation image. Josephine is kneeling, receiving the crown. She gets to be the Lady of Victory, securing all that glory she always craved. But the irony is just devastating. She has the literal crown, but kneeling right there, she has zero power left in their relationship. He's the master now, and his decisions are no longer guided by an obsession with her. Napoleon starts making what we can call the imperial calculation. And the logic is simple, and honestly ruthless. 1. Pure love is dead. 2. Josephine proved she was unfaithful and unreliable. And 3. The absolute biggest factor. The empire requires a bloodline. A conqueror doesn't just need a wife to stand next to him. He needs a legitimate heir to secure his legacy and keep France from falling back into chaos after he's gone. And sadly, Josephine just couldn't give him a child. But you know what's fascinating? 5. That is the number of years Napoleon spent in agonizing inner conflict before he actually did anything about it. Even after the betrayal, even knowing he desperately needed an heir politically, it still took him 5 long years to finally bring himself to officially divorce his first love. It really goes to show that some tiny trace of that early devotion was always lingering. But, well, the inevitable finally happens. December 15, 1809, the emotional saga officially ends. Napoleon formally announces the divorce from Josephine. Political reality fully takes the wheel. He tells her that his duty to France and the absolute necessity of an heir just have to override his personal feelings. The romantic chapter of his life is decisively slammed shut, and the dynastic chapter begins. And so the quest for a bloodline begins. He immediately sets his sights on an Austrian princess, Marie Louise, seeking a royal union to legitimize his empire and give him that son he desperately craves. But it leaves us with this incredible, provocative question to think about. How will this cold, calculated quest for a child, completely stripped of the burning passion he once had for Josephine, end up reshaping Europe all over again? Well, that is a question that would define the rest of his reign, and honestly, the rest of history.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right in and peeling back the layers of history to reveal a Napoleon Bonaparte you've probably never met before. You know, most of us know the historical giant, right? The brilliant strategist, the emperor who completely reshaped Europe. But the source material we're digging into today, a historical text titled The Great Eagle, strips all that legendary status away. It exposes the deeply personal, often agonizingly human side of a man who changed the world.
Think about it. We usually get this really stark contrast. On one hand, history gives us the stoic, iron-willed conqueror, the guy who sent thousands of soldiers into the absolute chaos of battle without even flinching. But our sources reveal that on the flip side, there was a profoundly vulnerable man, a guy who was fiercely protective of his family, desperately reliant on affection, and who actually openly wept over his kids and stepchildren.
When you picture the grand historical moment of his coronation, what really comes to mind? We see the ultimate public persona. We see this European autocrat who seems completely, totally obsessed with power, orchestrating one of the most magnificent displays of authority in modern history. I mean, it's so easy to assume that pure ambition was literally the only blood running through his veins.
But behind that heavy crown, the reality was a desperate, deeply emotional man. Take this line from a letter to his first wife, Josephine. "I am dying to see you, 1,000 kisses from one who loves you truest." During his grueling military campaigns in Italy and Egypt, while he's managing entire armies and dodging artillery fire, he would literally halt his command just to write these agonizingly intimate, lovesick letters begging for her attention. It's wild.
Let's move to Part 1, A Brother's Sacrifices in Poverty.
To truly understand the complex man behind the empire, we've got to look at his incredibly difficult beginnings. The Napoleon who commanded Europe was actually forged in the fires of extreme financial hardship. He was born into a modest family in Corsica in 1769, so definitely not a life of luxury. When he entered military school in France in 1784, he was isolated, mocked for his accent, and known as one of the poorest students there. Then, in 1785, tragedy hits. His father dies. Suddenly, a teenage Napoleon is thrust right into the role of provider. By 1789, he's living in absolute, extreme poverty, relentlessly sacrificing his own basic well-being just to send his meager lieutenant's salary back home. He did it to lift his mother and siblings out of crushing debt. He even wrote this heartbreaking letter to his mom, claiming, "I only eat once a day at 3 p.m., I sleep at 10 p.m., and wake up at 4 a.m. This is very good for my health." He was saying that just to hide his suffering from her. He was skipping meals, avoiding social events, and walking the streets of Paris in worn-out boots and a shabby gray coat. It proves his family always came before his own comfort. The big takeaway here? His protective instincts were born way before his empire.
All right, Part 2, Eugene, a father's adopted love.
This deep capacity for care extended beautifully to his stepson, Eugene. When Napoleon married Josephine, he took her son completely under his wing. But instead of treating him like a political pawn with some cushy palace job, Napoleon loved him fiercely through guidance. During the brutal Egyptian campaign, he brought Eugene along but insisted on absolutely zero royal treatment. He made the boy sleep in the dirt with the regular soldiers to build his character and earn the men's respect. It was a tough but deeply paternal affection.
He never saw the kid as a burden from a previous marriage. He would openly praise Eugene to his generals, saying, "Eugene deserves to be an example to everyone. If there is a hole in front of us, he is the one who extends his hand to me." He saw him as his greatest pride and his most trusted companion in the field. That kind of profound paternal pride goes completely against his ruthless reputation, doesn't it?
Now on to Part 3, Patron of Sciences, Arts, and Scholars.
So, it's easy to just view Napoleon as a brute military force, but his mind was actually deeply rooted in intellectual progress. He actively surrounded himself with the era's greatest astronomers, chemists, and poets. We're talking about brilliant minds like Monge and Berthollet. He treated them with a profound respect that you rarely saw from monarchs back then. In fact, he famously integrated hundreds of scientists directly into his military campaigns. He effectively made research and discovery a core objective of his conquests. He didn't just want to rule the world, he wanted to understand it. Just listen to how he signed his name during the Egyptian campaign. Bonaparte, member of the Scientific Academy and Supreme Commander. He was so incredibly proud of his intellectual pursuits that he deliberately listed his membership in the Scientific Academy before listing his military titles. That tells you exactly what he really valued in his heart.
Moving into Part 4, King of Rome, Paternal Joy.
So after years of desperately wanting a child of his own blood, the birth of his biological son was supposed to be a massive triumph. But it didn't go smoothly. During the terrifyingly difficult birth of his son, Napoleon was faced with an agonizing, real-time crisis. The doctors rushed him in a panic. The delivery was failing, and the emperor had to make an impossible choice: save his highly anticipated heir or save his second wife, Marie-Louise.
Defying literally every expectation of a power-hungry monarch who absolutely needed an heir to secure his dynasty, Napoleon didn't even hesitate. He explicitly ordered the doctors, saying, "Think only of the mother." He prioritized the life of his wife over the legacy of his entire empire. Fortunately, they both survived, which brings us to a truly incredible chapter of his life.
His private quarters totally transformed. This is where we see the emperor completely unmasked. The most feared man in Europe would literally cancel high-level state meetings just to roll around on the floor with his toddler. According to the sources, he would happily let his son ruin important government documents just to hear the boy laugh. He'd playfully smear gravy on his son's face at the dinner table, often shedding actual tears of joy. He was just completely captivated by fatherhood.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the heir crisis and heartbreak.
Because to reach that moment of ultimate paternal joy, an agonizing sacrifice had to be made. A sacrifice that really haunted him. We have to rewind a bit. What happened to Josephine, the woman he wrote those passionately lovesick letters to? Why did he have a second wife in the first place?
The answer lies in the harsh, cold reality of empire building. Josephine's inability to conceive a biological child was no longer just a personal sorrow for them. It became a massive geopolitical crisis. Without a clear biological successor, Napoleon's eventual death threatened to plunge the entire French Empire right back into the bloody chaos and civil war of the Revolution.
His deep, enduring love for Josephine was fundamentally at war with his duty to provide France with a stable successor. For 5 long years, he fiercely resisted mounting political pressure from his advisors, and even his own family, to divorce her. He was terrified of hurting her. He told his brother, "How do you want me to leave that woman? I don't want to throw my wife into misery just for the sake of greatness."
But ultimately, the weight of the crown won out. On December 15, 1809, the tragic divorce was finalized in a tearful, heartbreaking ceremony. Yet, even in divorce, his deep affection and loyalty remained totally intact. He personally guaranteed her a massive 2 million franc annual pension, ensured she was financially secure for life, and fiercely insisted that she forever keep the title of Empress. He maintained a close friendship with her until her death.
So when the cannons finally silence and the treaties fade away, a profound question lingers. Beneath all that immense ambition, we see a man who starved to feed his siblings, wept over his children, and ultimately shattered his own heart to secure a nation's future. Was the ultimate conqueror of Europe tragically conquered by the cruel demands of his own crown? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I hope this journey has given you a fascinating new perspective on the very human man behind the myth.
You know, when we hear the name Napoleon Bonaparte, our minds almost instantly jump to epic battlefields and the grand reshaping of Europe, right? But today, we're actually going to explore an entirely different kind of battlefield. We're looking at a man forced to make a practically impossible choice between the two things he coveted most in the entire world: his heart's true desire and his empire's survival. Welcome to this explainer. So let me ask you this. Would you sacrifice your greatest love to save your empire? I mean, it sounds like the premise of some fictional drama, doesn't it? But for Napoleon, this was a very real, absolutely agonizing calculation. The dynastic ambitions he harbored carried a deeply personal, devastating cost. Imagine for a second holding literally all the power in the world, yet feeling completely powerless over your own legacy. Let's dive right in and explore exactly how that impossible dilemma played out.
Section 1. The Ultimate Imperial Sacrifice.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're starting our story at the absolute height of Napoleon's power. Looking at this iconic coronation moment, you can just see it: Napoleon and his first love, Josephine, reaching the absolute pinnacle of Europe together. I mean, they had survived poverty, crazy political turmoil, and brutal military campaigns side by side. But hovering over this magnificent triumph was a really dark cloud: the terrifying reality that Josephine could not provide him with an heir. And his brother Joseph had been ruthlessly reminding him that without a royal bloodline, the empire would just collapse into civil war the exact moment Napoleon died. So the very thing that cemented his power was about to totally tear his marriage apart.
Which brings us to Section 2, a heartbreaking divorce.
And this brings us to a really grim turning point in December of 1809. Napoleon finally succumbed to the harsh truth that a biological heir was a strategic necessity. The evening of December 15th was, well, it was nothing short of dramatic. The emperor and empress were just having coffee after dinner when Napoleon finally broke the news. He basically told her this painful sacrifice was necessary for the sake of France. Josephine shrieked and completely collapsed onto the carpet in a dead faint. But the story doesn't actually end there. As the palace prefect, de Beausset, hurried in to carry her away, she quietly whispered this really surprising quote, "You are squeezing me too hard," which, of course, reveals she hadn't completely lost consciousness after all. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can break down the chaotic, almost unglamorous physical reality of that tragic night. Just think about the ruler of all of Europe awkwardly participating in this incredibly clumsy maneuver. Dupousset and Napoleon actually had to physically lift the weeping empress from the carpet. Napoleon had to hold a lamp and open doors while Dupousset carried her legs, carefully navigating down these narrow, dark, twisting stairs, all while trying desperately to avoid tripping over Napoleon's sword. It just strips away all that imperial majesty, doesn't it? It leaves behind just a messy, completely heartbreaking human moment. And the aftermath was honestly equally shattering. After officially dissolving the marriage, Napoleon, the man whose mere nod dictated the fate of millions across the continent, he just withdrew completely. He isolated himself at the Trianon Palace for 3 full days. He flat out refused to see his ministers, completely neglected state affairs, and was reported to be constantly weeping. He wrote letters to Josephine filled with profound grief, begging her not to let sorrow overcome her. The great conqueror was brought entirely to his knees by a broken heart.
Moving on to Section 3, the strategic Austrian bride.
But as you know, the machinery of an empire couldn't just pause for grief. Napoleon quickly had to transition to a highly calculated political maneuver to secure that desperately needed legacy. And there is just such a stark contrast between these two eras of his life. On one side, we have Josephine, this passionate, deeply loyal love who'd been with him since he was just a young, totally unknown officer. But she couldn't give him an heir. And then on the other side, we have Marie-Louise, an Archduchess of Austria. She represented cold, hard strategic necessity. Coming from one of the most ancient royal houses in Europe, a marriage to her would legitimize Napoleon's self-made empire and, absolutely crucially, provide the royal womb he required. Yet, despite the deeply political, almost clinical nature of this arrangement, I always find it fascinating that Napoleon became incredibly eager, almost giddy, really. The Austrian court had spent weeks planning an incredibly strict, highly formalized meeting protocol, but Napoleon, he just threw it all right out the window. He rushed out in a single, unmarked carriage, drove through the pouring rain, and literally ambushed his new bride's entourage at Courcelles before she even reached the palace. He just couldn't wait. He leapt into her carriage, completely ignoring all the rigid Austrian formalities, entirely desperate to kickstart his new dynastic reality. Which leads us to Section 4, Birth of an Heir. And so, we arrive at the absolute climax of Napoleon's dynastic dream in March 1811. But the birth itself was a complete nightmare. Dr. Dubois, the lead physician, came to Napoleon trembling, explaining that it was a dangerous breech birth, and he might have to make the ultimate choice between saving the empress or saving the child. This is such a profound moment. The ruthless general, the guy who sacrificed his beloved Josephine entirely for the sake of an heir, was now faced with losing his new wife. He looked right at the doctor and commanded, "Think only of the mother." Even if it meant sacrificing his much-desired heir, the human being beneath the crown just couldn't bear to let his wife die. So, the crucial point here is this number, right here. The suspense of this moment completely hinged on the number 101. When the child was finally delivered safely, Paris waited in breathless suspense, because by tradition, 21 cannon shots meant the empress had given birth to a girl. But if the firing continued all the way to 101 shots, it signaled a boy. Imagine the absolute silence over Paris as the cannons fired, 19, 20, 21, and then the 22nd shot thundered across the city. The crowd erupted into an absolute frenzy. He finally had his son, his heir, his king of Rome. And let me tell you, the arrival of this child completely transformed him. The dreaded conqueror of Europe just melted into this spectacularly doting father. Historical accounts tell these really heartwarming, intimate anecdotes of Napoleon literally rolling on the floor rugs with his son. He would sit him on his knee during meals and gleefully let the child smear gravy all over his face, laughing until tears came to his eyes. He strictly banned all state affairs from the nursery. If he was in there with his son, the geopolitics of Europe simply had to wait. Now for our final chapter, Section 5, The Looming Betrayal. Let's move to this timeline and see how this builds, because history is rarely a fairy tale, right? Just when his legacy seemed ironclad, the dream abruptly shattered. In just a few rapid years, a stunning collapse unfolded. In 1811, he experiences the joyous birth of his heir. He's literally on top of the world. But just 1 year later, in 1812, he suffers an absolutely catastrophic military disaster in Russia. His forces are totally decimated, and by 1814, he is completely stripped of his immense power and sent into a lonely, humiliating exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba. The empire he sacrificed everything for essentially dissolves in the blink of an eye. But the military defeat wasn't even the final blow. While Napoleon waited desperately on Elba, hoping his wife and his beloved son would join him, rumors of an ultimate betrayal began to swirl. Whispers reached the island that Marie-Louise was falling into the arms of a one-eyed Austrian general, and that the very military marshals he had made rich and powerful were secretly preparing to mutiny against him. Which leaves us with this really haunting question. What is the true cost of blind ambition? Napoleon broke the heart of his greatest love and basically compromised his own soul to secure a legacy, only to be left waiting on an isolated island, while those closest to him seemingly prepared to stab him in the back. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the past, and I'll see you next time as we unravel the fallout of this incredible piece of history.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When you hear the name Napoleon Bonaparte, what pops into your head? Probably a stoic, distant emperor, right? Moving toy armies across a massive map with cold, calculated precision. But, as we're going to see today, the reality of how he actually led, and specifically how he treated his own men, reveals a totally fascinating contradiction.
So the big question, was Napoleon a ruthless, bloodthirsty dictator, or was he actually a devoted father to his soldiers? We focus so much on the grand strategy and the sweeping empires that we completely miss the deeply personal, on-the-ground psychological tactics he used. We're going to look closely at how he treated the lowest-ranking guys in the mud versus his highest-ranking generals, and how that exact dynamic literally sealed his fate. To get to the bottom of this, we're pulling directly from our source text for this explainer, which is a really fascinating piece called The Greatest Eagle by Yusuf al-Bustani. What's cool about this text is that it strips away all that standard battlefield mythology. Instead, it really digs into the man behind the myth, his personal emotions, his defining traits, and his intense psychological grip on the people around him. It paints a picture of a leader who was, surprisingly, incredibly paternal.
Section 1. The Sleeping Sentinel, a leader in the trenches.
Okay, picture this. It's during the brutal Prussian campaigns. The men have been on agonizing, relentless marches for 3 straight days, with absolutely zero sleep. Napoleon is walking the camp perimeter in the dead of night, and he comes across a sentinel, a guard whose one job is to protect the camp. And this guy is fast asleep on the ground, rifle tossed aside. Now, by strict military law, this is treason. It's a death sentence. But instead of calling for an execution squad, Napoleon quietly picks up the guy's rifle and literally stands guard for him. When the patrol finally comes around and the guard wakes up, obviously terrified he's about to be shot by his emperor, Napoleon just tells him not to be afraid. He acknowledges that the exhaustion was just way too much for any human being to handle.
And this story brilliantly captures the absolute core of his leadership style with the common soldier, forgiving exhaustion to build unbreakable devotion. Think about that from a leadership perspective today. Showing supreme empathy in a moment of total vulnerability, that buys you infinitely more loyalty than leading by fear ever could. By pardoning that single guard, he didn't just save one life, he won the hearts of his entire army. That guard and every single person who heard that story would have fought to the death for him.
Section 2. Forging Legendary Loyalty, the Art of Motivation.
So how exactly did he scale this kind of devotion? Because it wasn't just a one-off. These were brilliant, highly deliberate psychological tactics. Our source points out that Napoleon would literally sit down in the dirt and share soup with his men. Before a big parade, he'd secretly find out the names and past deeds of specific soldiers. Then he'd just casually stroll up, call them by name, mention a specific battle they fought in, and ask how their elderly mother was doing back home.
I mean, imagine being a freezing, starving farm boy in the middle of Europe, and the Emperor of France knows your name and asks about your mom. It felt like magic. He made them feel seen. But he knew he had to institutionalize that loyalty too. Enter the Legion of Honor. Napoleon totally understood that you can't motivate men to march thousands of miles into cannon fire just for a few extra coins. You have to tap into their pride. So he created this merit-based system that rewarded bravery and loyalty directly, completely regardless of whether a soldier was born a noble or a peasant.
Our source captures exactly why this worked so perfectly. Quote, "The French soldier fights to answer the call of honor. If he suffers failure, he returns feeling humiliated." Napoleon had a profound grasp of human psychology. He knew for a fact that the drive for honor, the absolute fear of humiliation, and the deep desire to be recognized by their father figure commander was literally the strongest fuel imaginable.
You know, history really likes to feed us this myth of the distant, ruthless commander who just saw his men as numbers on a spreadsheet. But the reality presented in our text is completely different. We're talking about a paternal leader who ate their meager rations and who was famously known to walk the battlefields after the fighting stopped just to personally check on his wounded men. He absolutely did not shy away from the horrific realities of what he was asking his army to do.
Section 3. The Tolerance Paradox. Forgiving Bitter Rivals.
Now, let's look at how he treated his political enemies. Take Carnot, for example. Here's a guy who actively opposed the empire. Your average dictator would have introduced him straight to the guillotine. But Napoleon's reaction? He gives him a 10,000 franc pension and hands his military rank right back. Or take Bernadotte, an actual, literal conspirator. Instead of a firing squad, Napoleon elevates him to marshal and makes him the Prince of Pontecorvo. He genuinely believed he could just win over his enemies by bearing them in overwhelming generosity.
His unbelievable confidence is perfectly captured in his own words about General Clark. He said, "I do not want to search if he is sent to be a spy on me or not. I am publicly declaring that I forgive him." Napoleon's belief in his own destiny made him strangely lenient. He much preferred to forgive, utilize, and just absorb his former enemies into his own ranks rather than destroy them.
Section 4. The Seeds of Betrayal. Generosity's Fatal Flaw.
Now here's where things take a really dark turn. On one hand, you have the rank-and-file soldiers. They are starving, freezing, and totally exhausted, yet they fight with this legendary, unshakable loyalty because of that deep emotional connection we just talked about. But on the other hand, you have his top generals. Napoleon had showered these guys with unimaginable wealth, royal titles, massive palaces, and the result? They got comfortable. They got soft. They became super hesitant to risk the incredible, lavish lives he had literally handed them.
You can actually feel the bitter realization in his words when he confronted his elite marshals, guys like Murat. He told them, "You just want to stay in your beautiful palace in Paris." It hit him like a ton of bricks. While the common soldier still hungered for honor, the generals he had made filthy rich didn't hunger for anything anymore. They were totally sick of war. They just wanted to stay home and enjoy the spoils.
It's wild to watch how this command style fatally evolves over time. In 1796, as a young, hungry general, he demands strict obedience. By 1804, as emperor, he starts showering former rivals with titles to buy their loyalty. Fast forward to 1812, during the total disaster of the Russian campaign, and these exact same generals are openly questioning his orders. They vastly prefer their Parisian wine over freezing on a battlefield. And that brings us to 1814, the absolute breaking point.
1814. The year it all completely came crashing down at Fontainebleau. And here is the kicker. It wasn't the common soldiers who turned their backs on him. No, the rank and file were absolutely still willing to bleed for their emperor. It was the rich, exhausted top brass, the very marshals he had elevated, forgiven, and enriched beyond their wildest dreams, who marched into his room and forced his abdication.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question to think about. Did Napoleon's greatest virtue, his paternal generosity, actually guarantee his spectacular ruin? He conquered Europe by treating common soldiers like his own sons, forging an unbreakable bond through shared suffering and honor. But by applying that exact same indulgent generosity to his rivals and generals, he essentially created a class of men who had everything to lose and absolutely no desire to fight. It's a fascinating paradox of leadership, for sure, one that defined his unprecedented rise and perfectly engineered his dramatic downfall. Anyway, that wraps up our explainer for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I really hope this gave you a completely new lens through which to view one of history's ultimate commanders. Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today, in this explainer, we're going to unpack one of the most dizzying, dramatic, and honestly heartbreaking character arcs in all of human history. We're looking at the tragic fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. We're going to trace his historic rise to just absolute unmatched power across Europe, and then follow that incredibly rapid, devastatingly lonely fall that came right after. It's a story of military genius, sure, but more importantly, it's a masterclass in human hubris and the shocking betrayals that happen when transactional loyalty finally runs out. So, let's get right into it.
Okay, let's just look at this stark contrast right off the bat. I mean, on one hand, you have the undisputed master of Europe, a guy so incredibly powerful he was literally distributing crowns to his family members, and on the other hand, just a few short years later, he's an exiled prisoner, dying completely alone on a desolate rock. Starting here at his absolute peak is really the only way we can understand just how incredibly far the Emperor of Europe ultimately fell.
Section 1. The Peak of Glory, Master of the Continent.
So, to really set the stage here, let's rewind to the year 1810. Napoleon's empire was rivaling the legendary days of Charlemagne, and his word was absolute law. He had crushed massive coalitions, reshaped the map of the world with an iron will, and he wasn't just conquering territories anymore. He was handing out entire European kingdoms. We're talking Italy, Naples, Spain, Westphalia, Bavaria, Saxony, giving them to his brothers, relatives, and top generals like they were personal gifts. He pulled these men up from nothing and placed his own bloodline on the thrones of the oldest nations in Europe. It was a level of dominance that was completely unprecedented.
Moving into Section 2, the military betrayals, the sting of ingratitude.
Now, what's fascinating is that elevating his inner circle came with a massive hidden cost. The very men he had showered with insane wealth, grand titles, and these huge estates, well, they had grown way too comfortable. That hunger that won them the empire in the first place was just gone. And you can clearly see Napoleon's growing, desperate frustration in his own words to them. He said, "You are men of wealth and importance. You take no pleasure except in staying in your beautiful house in Paris." He realized that his closest marshals, guys like Berthier and Murat, had completely lost their fighting spirit. When the massive coalitions of Europe started marching against France, these generals basically decided they didn't want to risk their lives or their new fortunes on the battlefield anymore.
And that leads us right to this incredibly heartbreaking mutiny. By 1814, at Fontainebleau, the ultimate betrayal went down. The very men Napoleon had raised from the mud to the absolute highest echelons of European aristocracy bluntly and callously refused to follow his orders. Marshal Ney coldly declared, "The army will not obey." And Marshal MacDonald, he told him straight to his face, "We have had enough." The great conqueror who had outsmarted entire nations was finally cornered and forced to abdicate, not by enemy armies, but by his own exhausted, ungrateful inner circle.
Section 3. The Waterloo Disaster, Errors and Treason. So, even after his first exile, Napoleon actually comes back, but the unraveling of his military machine just kept going. His strategic genius was definitely still intact, but it was completely undone by fatal, catastrophic failures from his subordinates. Marshal Marmont, a man Napoleon deeply trusted, committed shocking treason by aligning with the enemy. And then at the Battle of Waterloo itself, Marshal Grouchy's catastrophic battlefield blunder of failing to march to the sound of the guns fundamentally ruined Napoleon's entire strategy from the inside out.
But, as absolutely devastating as it is to be betrayed by your brothers in arms on the battlefield, an even more shocking heartbreak was waiting for him in his personal life. While his entire empire collapsed around him, we really have to ask, where was his beloved wife during his absolute darkest hour? Which brings us to Section 4, A Wife's Shocking Betrayal, the Austrian Deception. You see, to secure a royal bloodline, Napoleon had actually divorced his first wife Josephine out of this desperate need to solidify his new empire. He married Marie-Louise, a young Austrian princess, truly believing this union would secure peace with Austria and give him the dynasty he was craving. But her loyalty, it completely vanished the second the tide turned. If you look at his private letters, you can just feel his desperation. He writes, "I hope your health allows you to bear this. You can always depend on me." This brilliant military mind, this terrifying conqueror, was literally reduced to begging for her presence and support, genuinely believing she would come to him in exile as his whole world burned down.
But the agonizing reality here is that while Napoleon was pacing the floors, anxiously waiting for his wife to join him in exile, She had completely different plans. Marie-Louise wasn't coming. Actually, she was actively being seduced by a one-eyed Austrian general, Count Neipperg. So while Napoleon is waiting for his family, the mother of his child essentially started acting like a hostile enemy to France, openly rejoicing at the victories of the Allied forces against her own husband.
And man, the cruelty really didn't stop there. Marie-Louise not only abandoned him for another man, but she made sure that his beloved son, the King of Rome, his ultimate hope, and literally his entire reason for building this dynasty in the first place, was permanently kept away from him in Vienna. Napoleon would never see his son again. It's this profound, piercing, personal tragedy that completely broke the spirit of a man who no army could previously break.
Section 5. Lonely Exile and Legacy. The Prisoner of St. Helena.
The sheer weight of those military mutinies, combined with this massive spousal betrayal, just pushed Napoleon into a dark abyss. Sources actually note it even briefly drove the great conqueror to contemplate suicide. The descent was just relentless chaos. I mean, look at the dizzying speed of this timeline. In 1814, he's forced to abdicate. Then there's this frantic glimmer of hope in early 1815 when he returns for the 100 days, but that's followed immediately by the total disaster of Waterloo. And finally, by late 1815, his permanent exile. It is a breathtakingly rapid fall from grace.
And his ultimate destination? He was exiled to the remote, unforgiving, rocky island of St. Helena, way out in the middle of the South Atlantic. He was completely stripped of his grand titles, totally isolated from his beloved son, abandoned by his wife, and betrayed by the very generals he had made rich. The guy who used to distribute entire nations to his friends was left to die on a tiny rock utterly alone.
So, I want to leave you all with this final thought to chew on. Was Napoleon Bonaparte just a ruthless conqueror who finally met his inevitable downfall? Or, when you look at the heartbreaking treason of his closest generals and the cruel deception of his own wife, was he ultimately a tragic victim of the very people he raised to power? The contradictions of his legacy really show us that absolute power very often leads to absolute isolation. If you want to keep exploring the incredible, dramatic complexities of history with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives just like this one. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.